Brilliant. 6 o'clock and welcome everyone. My name is James Colborn. I am, as probably best described, somebody who spends a lot of time working with AIM devices. I do a lot of online tutorials and I partner with AIM in the US and in this case, AIM Technologies and AIM Shop here for the UK and the international audiences to be able to talk about different aspects of using the AIM software and hardware. Now, today we're going to be talking about actually devices and configurations. We're not going to talk about analysis today, which is probably one of the first ones that we've done that's not as focused on analysis, but we're going to talk a lot about how do we set up AIM devices and thought process and best practices and to really look at that. So before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind. The first is if somebody can give me just a yes in the chat box that you can actually hear me. That's the first thing, which is good. Yes, thank you very much. Kevin was the first one to answer. Thank you for that, which is perfect. And then the second thing I'm going to ask is that if you could all keep yourselves muted, just in case somebody comes in and has a chat or your phone rings as we're going through, and it doesn't disrupt the conversation with others. So very much appreciate you staying on mute. Please use the chat box throughout the whole time to be able to ask questions and keep the conversation going, which is fantastic. We've seen that happen. And if you want to ask a more serious question that can't be sort of covered over general chat, pop it in the Q&A box and we'll get to that one as we go through. But without further ado, let's get into some of the content. Now, most of today will be a live demo, as it usually is. But today we're actually going to have a little bit of slideware to start with. So just bear with me just 1 second while I share the screen here. So just give me 1 minute and I will do that. And if I click on, you're probably all seeing the setup. Let me just click on this. And then if I do this. So you should all now, hopefully, again, just give, is the full screen covered? If someone can give me a yes in the box, that would be lovely. Which would be good. Yeah, lovely. So let's get going. So today we're going to talk about configurations. And I have to say that this is one of the things that I have learned to appreciate more and more as I've used AIM devices more and more. Now, like most of the people that we work with, or maybe yourselves, started out with an AIM Solo. I still carry mine absolutely everywhere I go with me. It's always in my race bag, where the configuration is limited, but still optional and still possible. You can change it. But it didn't really give you all of the opportunities that one of the more advanced dashes has in terms of being able to sort of set up your configuration and really what you want to be able to use it for. And so I think in today's webinar, we're going to focus on a few key areas, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. But really what I want to be able to do is to talk a little bit about some of my experiences, some of the opportunities that I've seen with the device, and also to talk a little bit about the setup, because this is an area where I personally believe there are so many possibilities of configurations that it's brilliant in one regard that you have all of these opportunities to set it up and customize it for you, but it also creates a second side of the conversation, which also adds an air of complexity, and that complexity can sort of create a little bit of either confusion or, you know, what does this do? I'm also one of those people who shied away from many of the tabs in a configuration for a long period of time, not knowing exactly what they did. But like many of us during lockdown, I spent a lot of time watching many of the webinars that were presented, many of which I'm sure all of you have seen. I know that some of the people who organize and run those for AIM are actually on the call today, which is nice. And so it's helped me understand a new appreciation. And I found my best way to describe it, workflow with data has improved. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover 4 key areas. The first we're going to look at is going to be the basics of configuring an AIM dash or logger. I think this is really important to look at the basics of the device itself, a few of the key components. We're going to look at the CAN network, which no one's ever explained to me exactly what CAN stands for with AIM, so I'm guessing it's Connected AIM Network, but I could be wrong. But one day someone will tell me, but basically you hear a lot of reference and you see it documented that it's called the CAN network, and so I want to talk about that a little bit today. And I'm actually going to show some of the examples. I set some up this morning for fun for the for the demonstration, and some which I use every day. So a lot of the examples, and then we're actually going to look at that in more detail. So we're going to understand a lot of the options that are available. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're actually going to set up a device as a group. I'll do it and you can follow along and see what I'm doing. And hopefully it'll make sense as we talk about many of these particular components. So that's the plan for today in terms of what we're going to cover. Now, there's a few key components that I want to be able to think about. Now, the basics of an AIM configuration, I think, fall into three major, that's four fingers, sorry about that, that's three major sort of areas. You have devices which range from an AIM Solo 2 DL. So if you've got an AIM Solo 2, this presentation may not necessarily be right for you. And I want to caveat that it's hopefully entertaining and interesting, but it's not necessarily something that's as relevant for you if you've got a GPS-only device. But if you have an AIM Solo 2 DL through to any of the Evo series loggers or the MX series, anything where there's a dash or there's a logger involved, then this configuration and this webinar is really designed for you. And I think it falls into three key areas that we've got to think about here. And then there's a fourth, which is where I spent most of my time and I spend most of my conversation. So if you've got a Micron, that's great. If you've got any other devices where you can plug additional input in as well. It's only the GPS devices only which aren't as applicable to this conversation. So first things we have to think about data coming in, the inputs, the sources of data. Now, when we think about where that data is coming from, it can come from multiple areas, and we're going to come to talking about key aspects of where those sources of data are coming from, which will feed into our AIM device. And if we think about sources of data, these are really the things that we want to be able to measure. We want to be able to measure how fast is the device, how fast is your, let's put it in the context of a race machine. Let's talk about a car or a motorcycle in many respects. I'm sure this is applicable for people who have boats and people who have sort of other uses as well. I've seen some ATV applications lately, all sorts of things. But let's talk about cars, which is where my experience is going to be today, and potentially motorbikes as well. So the source of the inputs are going to focus on what you want to learn and what you want to measure and what you want to be able to watch for your vehicle. Things like speed, RPM, somebody mentioned temperature on the chat box, oil pressure, steering position. I could name so many, we can go on forever. But these are the sources of input that are going to get fed into the device itself and going to get fed into that network of information. I'll explain that more as we go through. So these are your inputs. And when you start looking at the tabs on a configuration, and some of this may not make sense to you today, but it will as we start going through the webinar, you'll start seeing that we have multiple places where those inputs can come in from. There are really three major areas of inputs. The first that every single device has is GPS. And that GPS data is coming in, so it gives you things like GPS speed, or it gives you latitudinal, longitudinal information. So there's GPS type data, and every device, not even a Solo 2, that's what it's for, a Solo 2, every device has that. But then we start getting into the other devices from a Solo 2 DL onwards, and that's where we start adding in additional inputs that can come in from two other locations. There is actually a third, and I'll show you on the device, but it's harder to explain on this. So the first of the remaining two is coming from channels that you plug in or you connect to your car to measure certain components. So I may attach an RPM sensor to measure the RPMs of my vehicle. I may attach a brake pressure sensor to be able to measure brake pressure and oil pressure and so forth. So there's sensor-based information that you can attach to key components of your vehicle to be able to measure that. And then the third major source of inputs of sources of data that are coming into your vehicle will be coming from the car's actual ECU. Now, I'm currently using a car that doesn't have an ECU, but I'm still using that ECU channel, and I'll talk about that as we go through. But most people who've got a more modern day car have the opportunity to feed in information from an ECU that may be coming from a motorcycle or a race car, maybe slightly different with a kart, and that may be similar to my sort of open wheel Formula Ford experience. But in each of these scenarios, there is, the ECU conversation will send all of the information that's coming from the engine management system, or sub-selection sets of what's coming from the engine management system. So those are your major sources of inputs. Then what you've got to think about is, what do I actually want to do with that data? And the biggest section as we configure a device is basically device operation. What am I going to do with that information to be able to make the device operate? And the reason I mention this is device operation, even if you're using a logger, chances are you've got that logger attached to a dash so you can see, just like the dashboard of your streetcar, the same thing applies with the loggers and the dashes that you have from AIM. You want to be able to operate that data. And so you want to be able to configure the dash, just like the one we can see in this picture here, to be able to show you key components about what you want to know as you operate your vehicle. So you're going to want to be able to see a tachometer if you want to see the RPMs, a speedo if you want to see your GPS speed. You're going to want to see alarms if your engine's getting too hot or your oil pressure is getting too low. You're going to be able to operate that device to allow you to be able to effectively operate your car, motorcycle, whatever you're using the dash for, that you've got it set up. And if you think about it, in many instances, when people think about setting up AIM devices or any of the sort of like the data acquisition solutions that we have, it's not just data acquisition. We're effectively replacing the dashboard and the analog dials that are on our device, on our cars or whatever, let's say vehicles, with an actual dash. So we want to be able to figure out how to configure it so we can see where that rev band sits and where those lights show up in terms of where I need to shift gear. And I want to do that so I can use and I can operate my vehicle. And so that's really important in terms of device operation and how you operate your vehicle. Then the third component is then once I've got that data into the device, then I've got to send it out. I've got to, I can send the data somewhere else. And this is interesting. I've seen, and this is where it gets super interesting and way beyond my comprehension. It might be something that later webinars we look at. But I've seen scenarios where people have set up scenarios where if information meets a certain threshold within their device, it sends a trigger to do something else on the vehicle. And so let's say, for example, if your AIM device notices that your engine temperature is too high, it might send an output to be able to trigger the radiator fan to kick in. It's actually quite interesting as to how that all happens. But now when you think about a lot more of the advanced AIM power distribution model, you may see PDM here, there, and everywhere. That's some of that sort of component of knowledge and data from the device, then triggering something else. We're not going to talk about that too much, but the most obvious example of an output, if you work with AIM devices, is a SmartyCam. I want to send the data from the logger as to what's happening in terms of speed or what's happening with driver inputs such as feet movement or brake or accelerator or throttle to the SmartyCam. So there's an output as well. And then the most obvious and biggest output of all, which we all use and hopefully everyone uses. I still have scenarios where people don't actually plug the device in, but at the same time, data download is the most obvious one after that. All of this data gets gathered together from the inputs and then operated on the device, and then that gets set out as data download that we can use for analysis. And that's what we want to do. We want to be able to figure out how to go faster. But data analysis doesn't help you necessarily in the moment when you want to be able to see how fast you're going or where you want to be able to shift. And so it's understanding all those aspects of the configuration are super important. Now, what I wanted to do was I wanted to now start breaking it down into talking about the sources of input, because this is an area that I think is, I wouldn't say confusing, but it's definitely something we should be aware of, which is, let's talk about the inputs that go into your AIM device, because this is super important that we have this information in mind, because these are all the individual data components, or now you could refer to them as channels, that will allow you to be able to figure out how to operate your device, or they will allow you to be able to figure out how to be able to configure a view or some variable within there to be able to tell you something or help you operate your vehicle better, or to, in essence, analyze what's happening with your car. Now, as I said, there's 4 key areas, and you'll see this in nearly every configuration that we set up, and you'll see this as we go through and set it up together, but it's important to set this up to start off with. The first, on nearly every device you'll have, I think it's on every device, but if you're using an AIM Solo 2DL, you won't have this list of channels. You'll basically just have a few of these as options. If you're using a full logger with expansion capabilities, you may see tons of these. But all of them will have a variable which will allow you to have a series of channels, which are really a representation of sensors you're plugging in. So I have all of my channel ports in use on my car. I will show you that in just a minute so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. But each of the ones on my car is mapped to a different area. I have one channel's mapped to a sensor which is plugged into engine temperature, one sensor that's plugged in mapped to oil pressure, another sensor that's plugged into brake pressure for the front, another one that's plugged into brake pressure for the rear. That allows me to do bias. Don't worry, I'll show you that as well. And so these are all different sensors that you configure in your vehicle. This is fantastic and very useful in terms of being able to set up your overall car. Now, interestingly, you'll also notice that there's speed channels. That's if you want to have wheel speed sensors, so you can actually attach a sensor to your wheels, so you can do wheel speed. Some people like to have wheel speed sensors on each of the wheels so they can see if they're getting wheel spin. GPS speed will never tell you if your wheels are spinning, but a wheel speed sensor will. And so all of these are different sensors that are attached to different parts of your car that you then map to this area. So that's the first sort of area of input. The next is GPS. So on all the devices that are either connected to, let's say, one of the GPS 08 or 09 devices, if you're using an older logger, and I haven't actually covered off on the fact that all of the conversation today will focus on Race Studio 3 and not Race Studio 2. So if you've got an older device, feel free to ask questions. We can talk about that. But today's focus is more on the more modern day devices. And I have to say that it's now, I think 2014 was when I first started using Race Studio 3 with more modern day loggers with what was an MXL2. And so chances are many of you are using this. But if you're not, happy to answer questions at the end. So the second thing we want to focus on is a GPS. That GPS is coming from either the unit itself, if you've got an AIM Solo 2DL, or if you happen to have a GPS sensor plugged into your car. Typically, we've got GPS 08, but if you've got a more modern GPS 09 with a lot more sensitivity, I'm jealous because I don't have one, but at the same time, they're brilliant in many respects. And that will give you a lot of information from the GPS point of view, which I have to say, I still use all the time, even though I've got all the other sensors as well. And so that will give you things like your GPS speed, the way that the car's moving in terms of lateral or vertical acceleration, inline acceleration, very useful data. And then similarly, the third area that you've got is you've got information from the device itself. So I've just highlighted a couple of here that are here, but you know, one of the questions I got asked the other day, and it's funny, all my experiences are sometimes relatively personal in terms of what I go through, but I'm just having my engine refreshed because it's 2 years old. And we sort of said, okay, well, brilliant. I want to be able to service this engine after, I can't remember how many thousand miles it was or hours of usage. Well, the device has an odometer. So as you log it and plug it in, the actual device is connected to your car has an odometer that you can reset. And so I've just reset the counter because the engine's been refreshed. So I can now see, you know, the amount of miles that have been done on the vehicle. So useful to have that, and that's on the actual device. Now, the last component, the fourth area that I wanted to talk about, is the vehicle ECU. And there are thousands of different ECU mappings that are available from AIM that allow you to plug your device into your car, which will then feed directly into your AIM logger, all of the channels that are coming from the car's ECU or the car's sort of clever brain. And the more modern your car, the more data that is here. So I've been recently been working with a friend on a race M2, and the number of channels is just remarkable. It's sort of like anyone who loves data's dream in terms of all of the different things to be able to work on. But depending on what you're working on. So today we're going to have a look at a BMW Mini, which gives us a nice set of channels to be able to use as part of the example. But we plug that into the device. And if you're wondering, have I got the right cables? I do often get asked, what cables do I need, whatever's going on. That's where you just sort of pick up the phone and talk to the folks at AIM Shop, tell them the car what you want to do, and they'll make sure you've got the right cables, the right harness connected to your device, and all the right plugs and things that you need to be able to plug in. And that's really important. It's unique to your car and what you want to be able to do in terms of what setup you have. So I'm just making sure that we have an overview for everyone today. But in many instances, you get this vehicle ECU where you've got all these additional channels. You can see they're all named. It's on here. Now, interestingly, if you have a car with an ECU, don't expect all the naming conventions to be as clear cut as this. Some of them are coded if that's the best way to use them in terms of what the manufacturer calls it. So sensor SP123, but could be speed sensor, who knows? And we'll talk about that as we go through it, and that's quite an interesting thing to set up. But these are all your inputs. Now, one of the things that's really important to know, you can have all of these. You don't have just the vehicle's ECU, or just have sensors, or just have GPS. However, it is unique to the device you're using. So if you happen to be using an AIM Solo 2DL, don't expect to be able to plug in additional channels and sensors. Whereas if you have, let's say, an MX series, you can plug all of this in and then some. And some devices only allow you to have one ECU plugged in. And there's all sorts of varying we could go on forever as to what, that's where you want to be able to make sure that you're on the phone to the AIM folks to be able to say, this is my car, this is what I want to be able to do. And they'll help map out what the right configuration is going to be for you. But in essence, if you're lucky enough to have an option having all of these available to you, and you'll be like, oh, is that useful? And I'll show you how very much useful that is as we go through. So last thing I wanted to be able to talk about is I wanted to be able to show what we mean in terms of that network of connected devices. Now, the first look of this, I put this slide in. The first time I looked at it, I was like, ooh, that's a bit untidy is probably the best way to use. But what I thought I'd do is I'd demonstrate sort of inputs and outputs from the car, because they're powering different elements of different parts of the vehicle as it's coming in. So green are inputs into my Evo 4S, and red are outputs that are powering or doing something else. And so you can see that on my Evo 4S that I have set up on my particular vehicle, the green represents the inputs that are coming into the car. So you can see from the top right where I have the GPS 08 that plugs into the GPS plug and gives me all the GPS sensors, to the bottom row that gives me all the separate channels that are available to me. So I've got the RPM sensor coming in, then I've got throttle position, brake pressure, water temperature, and two oil pressure and two brake pressures. I'll explain why I have two brake pressures later on. Most of you probably figured it out already, but at the same time, it's useful because it helps you understand a little bit more about the vehicle dynamics that are there. So all of those are green, and there's one other that I have in there, a tire pressure monitoring system, which plugs into the ECU. And even though my car is built in 1988, so no ECU attached to that old Kent engine that I have, it still leaves that ECU port open where I can plug in an additional device. If I've got an empty port and I've got a device I can plug in. And so I've actually plugged in a tire pressure monitoring system that uses that ECU port for additional information. So those are all inputs. All of that goes into the device that allows me to then be able to figure out how to operate the vehicle. So then the information needs to come out, and it's then outputs that helps us operate. And so the red lines are basically outputs. And so you can see that from either the expansion port, which is where I send out to, as you can see here, a data hub. I power my dash, I power my SmartyCam. I have a memory module, which if anyone's got an Evo 4S, get a memory module, because having to hide that USB cable and then find it and then hide it and then find it and then hide it is such a nuisance. And so being in a position where you can just easily plug something in and out and just grab the SD card, that's fantastic. And so this is where I send the information out to. So this is my actual network of information that's available. And it's a really useful solution. Now, I've got a quick, someone's mentioned in the chat that, unfortunately, I'm missing some of the ECU channels that are available on the ECU, like oil temperature, gearbox. I think there's a few ways of being able to do that. The first is we may be able to ask for an ECU or a mapping to be created. If it's too old a vehicle, you may have to use sensors. I had a 2000, it was built in 2001 or 2002 BMW E46. We turned into a series in the US called Spec E46. And even though it was there in the ECU, we never got it working properly. So we actually had to attach sensors as well. So the older the car, the more hit or miss your ECU connection is going to be. I would say probably from 2010 onwards, there is rock solid. But anything before that, you have to find the right combination for you. Even though it's an ECU, sometimes you can't use it. So there's a few options, and we can probably chat about that later if we need to, which is there. So this is the setup that we have in sort of as an example. This is actually mine. Some people may be wondering why I've got the battery indicator as an input. it's interesting that when you run a Formula Ford, I'm sure the same thing potentially applies to things like carts as well, although I'm not a carter, so you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. I've had instances where the battery hasn't charged properly before I go out to a session. And if you know what your battery's voltage is that's powering your device, you can log that and you can have a warning on your dash that says your battery's low, which we've actually had to actually either replace a battery, or we've been in a position where we found out the battery was fine, the charger was broken. And so all sorts of different scenarios here that we can work through, but I just want to work through different examples through this presentation as to, you know, how I'm using it and then how we can use it for others. So that's really sort of like a quick sort of overview of what's going on. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to flick over to a live demo so you can actually see how we're operating and just go through some real live examples. And the beauty of Race Studio 3 is you can trial and error as many times as you like, because you can build configurations for devices you don't even own, just to figure out how you want it to be able to work and how you want to be able to work in. So I've been in many situations where I've actually created configurations here in London and then shipped them to somebody who may have been in Texas for them to then upload into their computer and then work on there. And so it's a nice way of being able to sort of trial and error in many respects. So what I'm going to do is I am going to open up Race Studio 3. A quick yes or no on the chat. Can you see my Race Studio 3? Which is good. Anyone? Oh, lovely. Thank you for commenting. I've just had someone's just popping out for a cigarette. It's not saying anything important. I'm not sure if I ever say anything important, Roger. But we'll go through and recap anything that anyone's missed. So I'm in Race Studio 3 here. As you can see, I need to update my tracks and I need to download the latest software. So anyone from AIM who's on here, I'm sorry about that. I configured these this morning and forgot to do that before our webinar. So when you're in Race Studio 3, the configurations tab is this cog here. It's this button here that you're going to use. And if you click on there, you'll be presented with this page. Now, if you don't have any configurations at all, this page will be empty and you'll have to start from scratch. But what you can see here is that I've got my actual configurations that I have for my SmartyCams and for my Evo 4S. I've actually got 3 configurations. I'm actually going to talk about that right at the very end, because that's one of the best practices that it's a very interesting, it's a sort of a polar, it's a polarizing question. And we posted this on a Facebook page for AIM users. And the question was, do you have multiple configurations for different sessions, or do you have one configuration you use for everything? And it was 50-50. 50% of people said, I've got one configuration, it's the only configuration I ever use. And then 50% of people said, no, I've got configurations, as you can see that I've got here, one for qualifying, one for racing, and one for testing. And I'll explain why I've got that in a minute. But as we go through this demo, you'll start to sort of appreciate that as we go through. Now, what I'm going to do to start off with is I am going to actually show you my actual Formula Ford setup. I'll show you the testing one because it's probably the most generic that is there. And you'll be able to see all of those devices that I just talked to you about as part of that CAN network. I'll show you them actually mapped to my device. Then I'm going to show you a different iteration of an MXL2, which I set up this morning with different channels, because this one would allow us to do an ECU. And then I'm going to finish off by actually setting up a device from scratch so you can see how to work that configuration through the actual process. So let's start off, with an Evo 4S. This is in my Formula Ford. And it's the one I'm using. Now, remember, the first thing I said was we have to talk about inputs, the data coming in that we want to be able to either operate our dash to do better in our car or a vehicle, whatever need be, and then also to be able to then analyze the data. So I don't have an actual car ECU. I did in old cars, I don't have in this one. And so it's been fun to be able to see. And what actually gets very interesting is if you get your sensors right, you don't really miss having ECU channels in the end. It's just a way of being able to set your car up. Sorry, excuse me. So you can see here, this is my actual setup. I don't have wheel speed sensors because I rely on GPS speed. Formula Ford's got 105 horsepower, so the chance of wheel spin is almost impossible. But in many respects, we have a situation here where I've got a series of different channels. You can see that I've got set up here brake pressure, oil pressure, water temp. Do you remember on the map I showed you all those? These are all the inputs that are coming into my particular vehicle. Now, if you're ever wondering how to set these up, and we might do a webinar on those, effectively what you do is you plug it into the device, you double click on the actual channel itself. You can name it whatever you want. I've named it brake PRF. Reason being is you can't have an extremely long channel name. So I was just fitting it in. You tell it what function you've got. So you've got all these functions as to what the sensor will be, and you'll get these when you buy your sensors. You'll say what actual sensor it is, and it's a long list of available sensors, which you'll have when you actually get it, and it'll have a serial number and a part number with it. Sampling frequency is always very interesting. Have you ever looked at anyone's data and gone, whoa, that's a bit busy? That's gathered a lot of information that no one's going to use. I still need to put a filter on my RPMs. They're a bit busy, but everything else, it's the number of times the device is going to sample per second. So in these instances, I've done 20 hertz or 20 samplings per second, which gives me a nice smooth line as I look at the data and the analysis. I don't need any more than that because it's not something that I really need to have that much frequency on. Somebody did tell me the other day why they wanted more than 100 samples a second, but I can't remember what it was they were saying. But generally speaking, I operate in around the 20 sort of area. But again, if you get stuck with this, talk to the AIM folks as you configure the device, and they'll help you set up and work through that. But generally speaking, that's what I use. Next is unit of measure. I'm in Europe, so we use bar. When I was in the US, we used PSI. And then the decimal display precision is, if I have it on the dash, and you'll see this later on, is it 10 miles an hour or is it 10.1 miles an hour? Because as racers, we always want to prove that we're going faster than the other racers. So I like a decimal point down to 0.1 or 0.11, because I say, oh, I'm doing 100.1 miles an hour, so much faster than you. But you have an option here in terms of the precision that you need. Generally speaking, with speed, I don't bother that much with it. But at the same time, when it comes down to things like PSI, 25 PSI on your tire or 24 PSI on your tire is a very big difference. And so having a decimal here matters. Once you've got it set up, that's all you need to do. And then when you plug it in and fire up your device, it's all starting to work. And so these are the ones I've got set up. Then I have my GPS settings here. These are my GPS ones that I've got set up. These come in from a GPS 08 that I had sort of connected, which were there. So again, these are just the ones that I have. Now, one of the things you may have heard me say earlier is that I have an ECU port available, which I'm not using because my car doesn't have an ECU port. So what I actually did, and it's something we may want to talk about at another time. So Kevin talks about RPM spikes a lot with old distributor. How can I stop it spiking? You can get a filter, Kevin. I haven't got one. I need to get one desperately, but you can buy an inline filter that smooths out the RPM so you don't have that crazy spiking, because I have an old Kent engine that isn't smooth. But again, that could be something that we talk about in the question answers, but at the same time, you can get a filter. I desperately need to get one. I should do a conversation on that. But anyway, so I've got my GPS channels. Now, I did talk about the fact that I don't have an ECU, but I do have an ECU port. So what I did, working with the folks at AIM Technologies, is I use one of their tire pressure monitoring systems that connects into the ECU port because it's an ECU mapping. Now, I've done a video on my channel where you can look at how to set those up and how to work with them and how to work with ECU. So I won't go into too much detail now. But again, we're talking about data coming into the logger. I'm using this to log my tire pressures and temps, which, when you can't change much on your car, these are really nice pieces of information to be able to have. And I would say even up to 2-3 years ago, these were so cost prohibitive that your tire pressure monitoring system would cost as much as the dash configuration itself, and then some. It was like, I used to sort of use it to the analogy that when I was young, my radio in my first car was worth more than the entire car. It felt a bit like that. And it's like, is it worth it? But now you can get these for £350. And they will give you enough information to be informed, and they're very useful in terms of operation. I had a puncture at Brands Hatch, and I was able to see that I had a puncture at Brands Hatch more than I was able to feel it, because it wasn't a complete deflation, and you could see it on the actual screen. And I'll talk more about some experiences I've had there as well. So that's what I'm using. So these are the inputs that are coming into my car. So that's all the data I have to play with. But now I have to start thinking about other aspects. And so when you're using a logger, and if anyone knows, an EVOS 4S, I showed you in the picture, is just a little black box. So there's no dash attached to it. It's not like one of the nice dashes with a lovely screen and everything. And we'll talk about one of those in a minute. I have to actually attach. So I have to now send the data from the logger to a dash to actually show something. So I have something called the CAN expansion, which is an expansion of the network. And this is my dash that I have set up. And so it looks just like this. So anyone who's got a car and has one of these sort of things. And I've started to use some of the inputs to be able to inform how this is set up. And I'm going to talk you through many of these particular examples as we go through. So the first thing is that I have some alarms set up with the data I have coming in. And you can see that if I double click on, let's say, for example, an overrev alarm, if I double click on this, I've set it up to be able to say the RPM, which is coming from the sensor, so the data in, show me on the dash if the RPMs on my Formula Ford have exceeded 7,500 RPM. Flash LED 4, which I'll show you in just a minute, but flash an LED, magenta, until, with a message saying overrev until a button is pushed. Basically, this means that I consciously in the car have to do something to turn off the alarm. And we'll go through alarms and everything later on. So don't worry, we'll do another webinar on the details of these, and there's a lot of videos to be able to help. But I'm starting to use the data that's coming into my channel to be able to help me operate my vehicle better, which is don't over-rev the engine, you idiot. Which you can put any message you like. I could put all sorts of different messages there. I kept it quite tame with over-rev, but you can message it anything you like. So that's just an example of setting those up. So I've used the data coming in, and I've used the RPMs to set up a shift light, and I've got over revs, low battery. Now I'm using those input data to be able to operate the device. And so that's one of the interesting areas. The next tab across the top is something called math channels. Now, if you've used Race Studio 2 analysis, or you've even ventured to use Race Studio 3 analysis, math channels mean something different. They mean a formula of data to be able to analyze something different. In terms of your configuration of your vehicle, as I've got it set up here, I'm using a math channel to be able to give me a new variable I can put on my dash. I can also log it, but I can put it on my dash. And the one I'm going to show you is bias. Because here what I'm able to do is I'm able to set up a math channel that says, tell me what the percentage of brake is going to the front versus the back. And so I have a little dial in the car. Many of us have got brake bias dials. But how many of you actually know how much quarter of a turn, half a turn, a full turn is in terms of how much percentage is that pushing to the front or the back of your car? Now, until I set this up, I had no idea. And it was one of those sort of things which is like, well, I think it's probably about half, whatever need be. But in many respects, having this allowed me to be able to take the sensors that I'd set up, brake pressure front, brake pressure rear. Remember, if we go back to channels, those are the ones I set up, to set up another way of operating the vehicle. And I'll show you this all comes together in a minute so you can see how they're all working. The next one across the top, this one, I think for a lot of people is like, what is a status variable? Well, this is if you want to create something that you log in your device that measures something which, or you want to create an alarm on the dash that combines multiple aspects together, but you want to be able to log it. So I'll give you an example. How many of you have an oil pressure sensor that constantly goes off or flashes when the car might be in a slow speed condition and you might just happen to be turning a corner? Now, there was a track that I used to race at in Seattle, Washington. It was called the Ridge Motorsport Park, where it's got a park called the Ridge Complex, which was loosely modeled on the corkscrew at Laguna. And as you turned left and went downhill, it was a very slow, very steep downhill left-hand turn. Every single time I went through that corner, the oil pressure lights would come on. It would distract me as a driver. And the last thing you want in the car as a driver is distraction. So what I did was I set up a status variable in this car that says, only tell me if my oil pressure is in a certain situation, because I'm driving, when RPMs are greater than 3,000 RPM and the oil pressure is less than 30 PSI. This means the revs are high, but the oil pressure is low. At that point, I do want to know that I have low oil pressure, because very soon after that, I could be dealing with a blown up engine. And so these are the sort of things that we really started to work through in terms of setting up status variables, which are useful as we go through. And I'll show you how those sort of set up later on. So that's the status variable. Parameters, I did a video on this, and this is probably the one of the most I'm not sure if I've got it right, videos where people are like, you told me to do this and now I didn't capture the start. I know, because I didn't capture the start of one of my races as well. When you have a device, how many times have you logged one lap wonders? So when you go to download your data, you've got a series of one lap, or one lap sessions. What that is that's the system logging when the car might be in the paddock, you might be on the way to pre-grid, you might be on the way to assembly, depending on where you're from. You might be in a position where the system is logging even though you're not on the racetrack. And really what you only want to be able to report is when you're actually moving. And so in many respects, what we have here is you can set different parameters that tell the device to trigger recording when you need it. And so in this instance, I've got it only start recording when, in fact, I need to change this. I've just noticed this is my actual setup and I wondered why it was still doing one lap wonders. And the reason being is I've got it to 3,000 RPM, but also I want this to say 30 miles an hour because you can't drive faster than that in the pits. And so if I change this to 30, you can see that this is nice. I can actually do my own setups as I'm doing a webinar, but you can see now this won't start recording until the revs are over 3,000 and the mile per hour is over 30. Now, one of the problems that we ran into here, and this is just a slight side note, if you say all and you do a standing start, you will miss the start because even though you got the revs, it won't start recording until you're over 30 miles an hour, which might be 50, 100 foot after you've started on the track. So you may want to change that to any, but it will just help stop recording so many of those small lap sessions that you have. Later, as you go through, we've got click on save so I don't lose that. Output signals, these just output information which will show up on the dash. Then we've got that SmartyCam stream that I was talking about. And we're not going to talk about CAN outputs because I don't have any of those set up, but in essence, you could have those if you wanted to. But as you can see, these are all the way I've used these variables. Now, if I go back to that CAN expansion, things are going to start making more sense because now you can see that I've got a display setup where I'm taking the RPMs from the RPM channel that's coming in. I'm taking the speed that's coming in here, and you can choose from this, the GPS speed, so I'm using multiple channels. I've got water temperatures coming in from my water temperature sensor, and I've got oil pressure coming in from my oil pressure sensor. And so I've started to use those input variables to be able to control some of the way the dash is set up. But here's some things that I wanted to show you. Because I'd set up this math channel that talked about bias, when I go back to the CAN expansion now, if I go down to math channels, they exist now. And so you can see that bias with threshold is there. If I drag that into there, now I have bias on the dash, and any of the dashes we have are able to do this. And now you can start seeing from the combination of your channels, you can now see brake bias on the dash. Remember I said that scenario earlier, which is what's the percentage of bias towards the front of the car? Well, I don't know, let me tell you what it is. And so in scenarios where, it's funny, one of the people who's on the call, Alicia, and I were racing in Castle Combe, and it rained unexpectedly halfway through a session. To be able to move your bias to the back of the car a little bit to be able to make sure you don't lock up your front wheels, that was particularly important because there's no runoff, was a very useful type of opportunity to be able to do. So just to know what that bias is helps you, and then it's logged and it's put in the channel. So these are all different variables, and you can see I've got my tire pressures. These are coming in from that ECU setup that I have. And so you can see that I've got the front left, front right, right rear left, rear right, so all set up that way. So now I'm going through this pretty fast. But the thing that we want to think about, and I'm just showing you in terms of real life examples, is you've got your channels coming in, and then you've got all the ways you can use them to be able to make you better at being able to, well, not better, they can make you more informed when you're in the car because you can configure them exactly how you want to be able to sort of operate your machine. Now, this was, an example using an Evo 4 logger. The next thing I wanted to show is that this is not uncommon if you want to be able to use an MX series. Same thing applies. But what I've done here is in terms of bringing in the inputs, I've got the channels that are coming in. So I've actually added in oil pressure, brake pressure, front and rear, the channels that I've added here, but I've also gone in here and I've added an ECU stream. So to be able to do that, all you do is click on change ECU. Scroll down to the car that you want. So let's say, for example, somebody said they were using a Volkswagen earlier. So you can go to Volkswagen, and these are the options of Volkswagens that are available to you. Now, it looks like Volkswagen has a standard ECU for many of their vehicles that are there. So you just click on that, and it will change the list of channels that you have that are available, and it will help you understand what they are. And so I could click on replay. Oh no, if I may have just clicked that, may have just changed my demo. But if I go back here and I go back up, you can just change whatever ECU. Now, chances are you're not going to do this more than once, because chances are you've only got one car with one dash. And so I may have actually just changed a few things around, which is good for demo. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to change it back to BMW Mini, and I'm going to click on replace to replace the ones I had before. And here are all the channels that are coming in from the actual ECU. So now from the car, I'm able to see things like the RPMs, the speed of the actual vehicle, which may be different to GPS speed, pedals, brakes, water temp, engine temp. Now you may be wondering, well, hold on a second, you put in oil pressure. Well, the reason I put in an oil pressure channel in this demo is that if I go to the ECU stream from the Mini, there is no oil pressure. I've got oil temp, but we don't have oil pressure. And so I've added an extra channel in the sensors area to fill a hole that I'm not getting from the ECU, which is available. Then similarly with any of the MX series, I can also add a second CAN. And so this is a second ECU. So what I've done is I've gone in and I've actually added in that tire pressure monitoring system. And you can do that here. Here's the AIM Technologies, TPMS. You just add that and away you go. And then you can go through different options. I've not got any CAN expansions this time, but these allow you to be able to add additional components onto your setup if you so wanted to do so. The math channel, I added the brake bias I showed you earlier. The status variable, I did a oil pressure trigger, and this one I did PSI is under 30 and miles an hour is over 80. And so slightly different, but I'll show you what that looks like as we go through. I changed the parameters to 20 miles an hour and 3000 RPM. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where I set up the shift lights. Now, one of the things you may be noticing is the software is so similar for all of the devices. It's just some of the options change. So if you're looking at this and go, well, I don't have an MXL2 and I don't have an Evo 4S, it doesn't matter. We'll show in just a minute how you can do that even with a Solo 2 DL going through. And so you can see here that I've gone in here, I've mapped to the RPM channel that I want my RPM lights to show up on the dash, starting at 6,000 RPM and finishing at 7,000 RPM and in 250 increments. If I want to see what that looks like, I just click on Active Simulation, and this is what it'll look like if it's prompting me to change gear. Then what I've done is I've gone in and said I want to be able to set up some alarms. So I've double clicked, and I can show you this water temp alarm that says if the water temperature is greater than 90 centigrade, please show LEDs 2 and 5 and put up a red warning on the dash that says water temp alarm. And it's until the condition is no longer met. And so this one and this one should show up red. And as you set it up, you can start configuring it with all the different channels as to how you want to be able to use this. Similarly with the display, I wanted to show that what I've done here is I've configured it with 2 different types of inputs based upon what's happening. I've got one page, another. So for this first page, what I've got here set up on page 1 is I've got all of these channels. So if I want to be able to set up this RPM, if I hover over it, it'll say, where do you want to get the RPMs from? And I've chosen to get the RPMs from the ECU here. If I want to be able to know what gear the car is going to be in, again, I'm going to click on here and it's going to say that's going to come from the ECU. But if I want to be able to see that the oil pressure is low on dash here, or what the actual oil pressure is, you'll notice that I've gone down to A and D channels, which is these channels here, and I've picked oil pressure. And so I've set this up so that you can see the use of different inputs to give you different variations and configurations of what the dash would look like. Now, similarly, I also said if you click the button, that will go to the next dash. Everything will stay relatively similar, but on the click of a dash, I've now set it up so you can see some slightly different variables. Now I've shown you what the front left pressure, front right tire pressure, rear left, rear right. So you can see what your pressures are within the particular vehicle. So now all of a sudden you're in a position where you can actually say, with this screen, I've set it up so I can see that bias, which was that math channel we created. And then these are the channels that I'm bringing in from that second CAN ECU. So again, inputs coming into the device and then using them different ways to be able to configure the views that you want to be able to look at. And so it's one of those things that you basically, I think, trial and error will start making that configuration you want. And one of the things that I personally do is that I find myself, I try something, and if I don't like it, I come back in and I tweak how it views. Because some of the advice that I would give to anyone who's setting up any of the dashes, alarms, anything that's on screen, only ever show information to a driver which is critical that they do something while they're on track, unless, of course, you're testing. But generally speaking, if you're in a race, do not fill the driver attention with alarms or alerts which don't have a material or a significant impact on their driving performance while they're racing, because you don't want to distract people. And I'll go back to that example that I gave just a minute ago in terms of the oil pressure dropping as I went down that sort of ridge complex at the ridge in Seattle. That I don't need to know that. All that's doing is distracting me and making me feel worried that my engine's going to blow up. If I'm comfortable with there being a position where oil pressure is low for a very short period of time going down a hill, and I only should care about oil pressure when the RPMs are higher than 3000 RPM, that's the only time I want to be able to know about that. But I do want to log it, but at the same time, I don't want to distract the driver. And that's a really important component. The number of dashes I see where people have got 10 pages with different variables, like go to page 3. I don't know how Formula One drivers do it. Go to strat 12, page 3, whatever it is. That's a mindset or a mind capacity which is beyond my comprehension. I think they're remarkable when they do that. My advice with our cars, don't fill yourself with information you don't need until you get back and download the data. So these are all the different ways that you can set it up. But I wanted to be able to sort of do one final thing to be able to show, because it hopefully will sort of bring home a lot of this conversation is, well, let's set up a device from scratch and talk through the process as we go through. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a beautifully simple Solo 2DL. A lovely little device, not as much involvement, and we can do it together and be able to work out what we're doing there. So just to show you what I'm doing, because I sometimes click without actually explaining what I'm doing. This is the configuration page. I already have 2 set up, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on new. This allows me to create a new configuration that should I have an AIM Solo 2 plugged in, I can upload that configuration to that particular device. And that's really important to know. If you have this, if you have an MXL2 connected to your device, load up this session, so forth and so forth. And so you can have as many configurations for as many devices as you like. Just make sure you plug in the right device for the configuration. So I'm going to click on new. And many of you may not have this. I have this because I play around too much. But if not, you're going to have this box that says all devices, and you're just going to scroll down to find the one that you want to be able to set up. Now I'm going to set up a Solo 2DL. And I'm going to put in here AIM webinar. You can call it whatever you like, but I'm going to call it AIM webinar when it catches up. Always happens when you do a demo, something happens. Maybe I should have done that software update. Oh, it won't let me upload too many words, which is good. Let's just say demo. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on OK. And now what this is going to do is it's going to open up that page we're all familiar with. So as I've talked about through all the other examples, first thing we need to think about data that's coming into the particular device. Now, what we've got here is we've got an AIM Solo 2DL, which does come with an RPM sensor, I believe, so you can plug it in, which is why it's illuminated here. And then the rest of the information that's available from the device is really GPS based. There isn't an option or within the device. There isn't an option to have all of those channels. And if you want to be able to compare it to one of the more modern devices, if you look at channels here, there are 8 for you to be able to choose from. If you look at the one from the Evo 4S, there are 5 to choose from. You don't get that with the Solo 2DL. It's a very simple and straightforward scenario that we have. So what we do here, what we'd like to do here is to be able to bring in some data from the vehicle. Now I'm going to continue using that BMW Mini example because it's what I rehearsed. But at the same time, if I wanted to add in some information here, then what we do is we go to ECU stream. Remember, we're setting this up from scratch. There's nothing here yet. It's a BMW Mini. I've got all the cables and stuff I need from AIM. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down to BMW. I'm going to find the Mini, which is in here somewhere, which is here. And I'm going to click on OK. Now I've got all of these channels that are available for me to be able to configure my Solo 2 DL with, which is really useful to be able to have as we're going through. If I wanted to be able to then connect a Lambda device to be able to measure air fuel density, I could do that if I had one, but I don't have one, so I'm not going to connect that. I could set up math channels if I need to, and these are all the options that are available. Remember, we set up bias on the other ones, or calculator gear. I don't need that because these are coming from the ECU stream, which is really useful. So I'm going to click on ignore that one. Parameters is an option, and I do want to set this up. So we're going to say custom conditions and say that I want this one to be 3000 RPM and or going faster than 30 miles an hour. The reason you do this is that this stops you from having those one lap records. Then we get to the Solo DL, which has an LED bar. Now we know that the RPM threshold on an AIM, so on a BMW Mini, if I remember rightly, I owned one once upon a time, is about 7,000 RPM. And so I can go in here and I can configure this, and I can say I want to be able to, I could have gear dependent, which gets a little bit more complicated, but is an option. But generally speaking, we have this, and I can go in and say, well, this is going to be 7,000, which is the maximum. And I'm going to put this down here. I've lost my mouse. Here it is. And I'm going to put this at 6,000. And then what I'm going to do is, I think I closed that too quickly. There we go. I'm going to make this so that this is all every 200 increments. So it grows every 200. It's funny when I do this, I'm like, this is going to be the best demo ever. And then these things take ages to be like, yeah, that's pretty slow. So we've got that set up. And if I click on OK, I can activate the simulation that shows me what the RPMs are going to set up in terms of there. Now I have an option of not using it for RPMs. I can use it for predictive, like an AIM Solo 2 without that. So you could have it so it says intervals of plus or minus best time. And if any of you are familiar with this, you could set it up so that if you don't necessarily want to be able to look at the screen all the time, just have a quick visual reference, you can set these up. So if all 5 of these LEDs are lit up, in this instance, you'd be half a second faster. So you have that option that's there. Then we get to the display. Now the display is really related to what's available on a Solo 2 DL. And there are 4 options. And basically every option is one incremental channel for you to be able to look at. So you could have one screen, which could be RPMs, which could be speed. So we can click on OK there. So what we're going to do is that's not set. There's nothing in there. But we know we've just mapped those ECUs. So we're just going to go to the ECU here. We're going to find speed. I'm just going to drop that in there. And so that's our speed. Remember, I'm very much somebody who loves the 0.1 increment just because I want to prove that I'm faster than somebody else. But you can change that as you need to. And the reason, the way you go to do that is you could actually go back to the ECU stream. You could find the speed here. You can double click on it. You can say, I don't want any decimal places. And then if I go back now to the display, this will change to the single mile an hour that we're actually using. So that's your option that is there. Now I can add another page where I want to be able to see, let's say, for example, I wanted to see engine variables that are there. So I can click on my second page. And here I want to be able to see information such as, I want to see water temperature. Oops. Hold on a second. Just lost my channels on the right-hand side. Maybe a slide. Always happens when you're doing a demo. You do your practice run about 3 or 4 times over and everything works perfectly, and then you do a demo and it doesn't work quite so well. So what are we doing here? We're going in here. And there should be, down here, a list of options available for you. But we have hit a snag. And that always happens in terms of where we are. Now, the other thing I wanted to be able to point out on this one, as we go through this, finally, you can set that up, is also to make sure you've mapped your SmartyCam stream, because this is an output from the device. And so in this instance, you're able to sort of output information as you need to. go into the SmartyCam. And so one of the most popular combinations that you do see of people using AIM devices is an AIM Solo 2DL connected to a SmartyCam. And those two often represent sort of track day packs. You see them, a lot of them. I saw one this morning, someone was asking questions on a motorcycle who had an AIM Solo 2DL connected to a SmartyCam as well. So there's a lot of options that are available for you to be able to use that as well. And you just set these up and map the channels to be able to send that out. And so once you've done that, effectively at that point, and belligerently going into C so I can change it again, but I think I've probably made a, somewhere along the lines, it's probably user error that I've done something that's making this not work as well as I'd like it to. But effectively at that point, we've set up the device. All we need to do then is click on save. And once we've done that, we now have that set up in our system, and we can just double check that I haven't done something sort of that I shouldn't have done here. So there we go. So if I click on here, this one we were going to have, just to finish this off to make sure I did it right, I'm dragging water temperature that is there, and the other one I wanted to have was, let's say for example here, we can also put in oil temperature. So you can have some engine variables that are available as well. So those are your two displays that you've set up. And I'm going to click on save and close that. Now, when I upload that to my AIM Solo 2DL, that's what the configuration is going to look like. And so that's how you set up many of these sort of processes. Now, the last thing I'm going to finish off with is people may be wondering, why have I got multiple configurations, testing, race, and qualifying? Well, let me show you. Same input comes into the car, but if I open up qualifying, and I go to the CAN expansion, and I show you what the dash looks like. The dash for qualifying, this is all I want to see. I have the page, and all I'm looking at for qualifying is how fast I am plus or minus against my best time, what the best time was, and the number of laps, which usually you get about 5 or 6. Then I have additional, if I get an alarm that says your engine's hot, I can flick the page. But this is what I see here. Whereas if I go into the race configuration and I double click here, just a second. What we're actually going to see is that I go back there for my particular setup. You'll also notice that my race setup is much more benign, which is I have RPM speed, the actual lap time, not predicted lap time, water temperature, and oil pressure. The essential information that I need and only need for a race. I don't need to say if I'm chasing a lap time. All I need to see is what the lap time was, whether the engine's getting too hot, whether the oil pressure is too low, what the speed is, and making sure I'm on top of RPMs. So these are all the variables that I want to do. And so gone through a lot today in terms of configuration, but it is something which is quite a meaty subject. I do want to go into further webinars where we talk about alarms in more detail and we talk about channels and those sort of things. But these are the basic premise that I would say of setting up your devices. So the question I have for everyone now, and feel free to come off mute or ask it in the question and answers box. I know there's been a lot of chatting going on. Or maybe ask the question in the chat box. Do people have questions? Anything they wanted to go over again? Was this useful? Just love to know if folks have got questions. Or we start off a bit quiet. Please feel free to ask the question in there. Please feel free to ask it in the chat box as well if you don't want to say it out loud. I'm happy to chat about that too.
James, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. Sorry to interrupt earlier about my cigarette. James, what it is two things. The first of which is just about the bias, the brake bias channel, which I use a maths channel for that. And I find, I think I mentioned in the chat earlier on, as you're on that part of your webinar, that the static brake pressure, i.e. if you're sitting in the car in the pit and the car's not moving, hit the brake pedal, you can see a great bias trace. It's fabulous. It'll give you a percentage, but I find that isn't an accurate representation of bias when you're actually out on the track, because obviously there's different pressures that you're putting in. So it's great for setting up a static bias to go, okay, the last race was wet. Did I move my brake bias forwards again? Can't remember, hit the brake bias. But in terms of using it dynamically, it's not quite so helpful. That's just a comment, really. The other statement I wanted to make, or the other issue I had, was the steering trace. I'm very involved with James Scott on radical sports cars, radical racing cars, and the steering trace is very jaggedy and very difficult to to get a real grip of. And you mentioned a filter. I don't know whether that's whether you've got any more information about that.
So the RPM trace is where the filter would apply, and I do get a jaggedy filter. The one thing I would say about the steering trace may be in the sampling frequency of how it's been configured, because the more frequency that you get, the more sampling you do, the smoother it might actually turn out to be. In many respects, because you've got a smoother number of dots. I always think about it in terms of sort of drawing dots, connecting the dots. And so it might be a word, I don't know if you've played around with that, but it might be a scenario of sampling frequency on the steering trace, because we've had them. What we were getting from the ECUs was pretty dreadful on the BMW. So we ended up putting on manual ones that we bought the steering position sensors, and that was much smoother and looked a lot stronger.
Right. Okay, I'll have a look at that. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Hey, no problem at all. I've got some questions in the question box as well. Is RPM configurable in that if I were to use an MXS 1.2 on two-stroke motorbike, then the RPM could? Yes. You can configure the RPM in terms of, it's called the R factor, which is the stroke factor. So you can adjust that as you need to. I actually had to do that on my engine because I didn't know about it until we started playing around with it. And I think the folks at AIM were probably annoyed at me. I was asking so many questions. It turned out to be something as simple as that. So yes, you can configure the RPMs. I don't know about a two-stroke, but we'll see. It was on a two-stroke motorbike, so we'll see. Next question from Marco. How do you deal with having multiple cars running at the same time and multiple laptops? Main issue is we have session configuration scattered between laptops. I think this is I would say that there is not an easy way of being able to, through the software, keep your configurations in somewhere like a cloud storage where you can all go and grab them. That doesn't exist. This is sort of like, I think, a discipline scenario, which I've seen on race teams where there is one, the best examples I've seen are where teams have said there's one guy, one laptop, multiple USB sticks with the data. And so somebody is sort of responsible for uploading all the stuff on the cars, but then when it comes to other people wanting to be able to work on different things, in terms of data analysis, they'll take the actual USB key and work with it. I think that there's multiple variations, but there's not an easy way, I would say, of being able to sort of work that through. The only thing that you do have an option with is if all of the cars are connected to a Wi-Fi network together, you do have the opportunity of multiple laptops seeing multiple cars at the same time. And so you can just drag and drop if you needed to, but I still don't know if that solves a particular problem that is there. But no, I'd say that's a workflow that you would work up yourselves. That's not something that is available in the software. Is that a SKU CH from Kevin? Don't know the answer to that one. That sounds like a I don't know the answer to that question. I'd probably have to have a bit more information on that one if needed. Let's have a look. Next question. So you told it should be possible cars in new 2000 to add ECU channels that are not pre-configured by Ada. You told it should be possible to cars new 2000 to add ECU channels that are not pre. Yeah. So getting a new ECU mapped, I think, is a conversation with AIM, just like getting a new track and a few other things. And so my recommendation there would be, feel free to send me an email or the email that you have from this webinar. And it'll be one of those things that over time, new ECU mappings get added to Race Studio 3. And you can actually see it in Race Studio 3 because there's constantly a little update in the top right-hand side that has a little green arrow that is downloading new ECU mappings to be able to use. And so I think that there are elements of by request. And so I would definitely work through that as needed on what particular vehicle that is there. You always have the option of filtering any channel in the analysis preset, thanks to Roger, who is, basically, you know, Roger Cadell, he is the person that I learn from, and then I tell other people stuff. And so very rarely is there anything new that I talk about that I've learned. It's only where folders need to be backed up to save mine. In terms of backing up, so here's the thing. The best way to think about managing your data is managing it in 3 different areas. Now, I've done a video on this on my channel. It's called Managing Your Data. One of the things that I do is I've mapped Race Studio 3 to a cloud directory, which means that when the computer's offline, it downloads the data when I'm at the track, and rarely am I online. But then when I'm back online in the cloud, it syncs, and then I've always got a permanent location of that particular data. So that's one thing that I do to be able to specify which folders I want to back up and how I actually get that used, which is useful. But for Matthias, I may have just butchered his name, I apologize. My recommendation there is to probably watch the video. So feel free to send me an email. I'll put it in the chat box here to everyone if you want answers to the questions on some of these things. And I'll share you the video on managing your data, because it's quite a long-winded answer, which might take me a whole hour to be able to explain. So send me an email, and the same applies to anyone if you've got questions as we go through, and I'll happily chat through some of those as well in terms of backup of data, which is good. Okay, any other questions? Any things that we covered today, feel free to write it in the chat box that you'd like to cover in more detail next time. I'm happy to talk about that. I do feel like I sort of skimmed a little bit over alarms and many other sort of variables, just to show you the sort of overview of the config. But if there's anything you like, email us or write it in the chat box and we'll happily go through. But yeah, any other questions, happy to answer them right now. If there aren't any more questions, I think that gear learning for future setup. Yes, absolutely. The gear learning, happy to do that one. That is one that I have personally worked through. There's actually a guy who I might see if he'd be able to do that with us as well. But gear learning is a great idea in terms of working through, because you can do a math channel, not just for bias, but also for the calculated gear that you're in, which I find is useful. And by the way, Roger Bromley, on the brake bias, totally agree with your point of view there. What I generally tend to do is that I look at where are the brake biases at the point in track where I brake the hardest. And so it's pretty, you know, what Roger said is when you're setting up your bias, it's a variable which you only get the truest reading when you're pushing on the brake pedal as hard as you possibly can. If you're at half brake or quarter brake or whatever need be, it doesn't read very well. And so if you're on track, it's hard to be able to know exactly what your bias is, because, you know, if I'm only just touching the brakes to get the nose down of the car, it won't give me a good read. And so I always find spots on the track which I know my brake pressure is at its highest. And that's the point in which I read it, because chances are that's also the end of a straight or something. So it's the longest brake zone too. So I find that helps in many respects too, which is good. And Roger's also talking about using histogram, which absolutely is fascinating afterwards. So if there aren't any more questions, what I'm going to say is a big thank you to all of you. I know we covered a lot today, so feel free to please send us an email in terms of breaking it down, because I think that this, once the variables that we went through today are endless in terms of the variations for personal preference and setup. Now, there are standard sort of default setups, and depending on your devices, less or more than what you can do. But really, one of the things that I will say is that, you know, if there are things that don't make any sense, feel free to sort of just ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. There's a ton of amazing information online, and there's also wonderful groups that are available on sites like Facebook where you can ask your questions, and everyone's always got great information. So hopefully this is a sort of a nice overview, and we can go into any detail anyone wants on next time. So with that, I'm going to end this webinar and say thanks to all of you for attending today. Goodbye.